The grand ballroom is perfectly air-conditioned. Waiters glide past in silence, balancing trays of champagne for the world's elite diplomats. On a stage, representatives from 24 nations step up one by one, smiling for the cameras as they sign the historic declaration to split the world's technology in two. It is a masterclass in global unity. They speak passionately about shared values, protecting democracy, and building a secure, collective digital shield. Everyone in the room nods along in quiet agreement. But watch the European executives sitting in the back row. Their smiles do not reach their eyes. They are checking their phones under the table, watching their company stocks tick downward in real time. They aren't feeling protected. They are calculating the exact cost of their own submission. Because beneath the inspiring speeches about a unified Western Front, a very different game is being played. The line being drawn in the Silicon isn't a defensive wall built by partners. It is a boundary dictated by a single power. While Washington frames this new technological iron curtain as a shield against foreign adversaries, its sharpest edge is actually pointing directly at its closest allies. A quiet, desperate panic is taking hold in the industrial boardrooms of Germany and the Netherlands. They are realizing that this alliance is less about keeping a rival out and more about locking them in. They're being forced to cut off their biggest customers, starve their own factories, and watch their best engineering talent pack up and leave for America. It forces us to look past the choreographed handshakes and ask a much darker question. What happens when the alliance meant to protect you becomes the very thing that hollows you out from the inside?
You know, to really grasp the physical, everyday reality of that hollowing out, you have to leave that perfectly orchestrated diplomatic ballroom completely behind.
Right.
You have to walk right into the spaces where the actual manufacturing happens. So for you listening, I want you to imagine stepping into a clean room facility on the ASML campus in Veldhoven, right in the Netherlands.
Okay, setting the scene.
Yeah, and the first thing you notice is this constant, low, rhythmic hum. It literally vibrates through the floor beneath your boots. That's the sound of extreme ultraviolet lithography machinery being assembled. And this is, it's the most complex manufacturing equipment ever built by human hands.
Yeah, the scale of those machines is just unbelievable.
Totally. So inside this hyper-sterile environment, you've got an engineer, let's just call him Martin, standing there in one of those suffocating, full-body clean room suits. He's looking at a diagnostic monitor attached to a machine that represents, tens of millions of euros in purely European research and development. And on that screen, a critical software update has just been flagged.
Okay, pretty standard so far.
All right, but here is where the reality of this new technological divide just snaps into focus. Because the lock on that software update doesn't come from his supervisor sitting in a different building in the Netherlands.
Wait, it doesn't?
No, it isn't a Dutch safety protocol at all. It is a fully automated compliance protocol, and it's originating thousands of miles away in Washington, D.C.
It's a literal line of code halting physical sovereign machinery.
Exactly. Martin is standing there staring at a digital prompt that is actively demanding American clearance before he can ship a Dutch machine to a long-standing client in Shanghai.
The concept of extraterritoriality, which usually just sounds like this abstract legal theory debated in law schools, it suddenly becomes this hard operational reality.
Yeah, it ceases to be theory. He is forced to click cancel. He just watches the diagnostic screen go dark, and the realization hits him. A line of code written across the Atlantic Ocean has snaked its way into a sovereign European clean room. It's turning European industrial capacity into, controlled territory.
Because they're standing inside a digital cage.
Actually, yeah. Europe is standing inside a cage, and the keys to that cage are quite literally being held in Washington.
And this brings us directly to the architectural blueprint of that cage, right?
Yeah.
The Pax Silica Summit from this past June.
Right, the grand ballroom moment.
Yeah. You have these 24 signatory states stepping up to the podium, formally declaring this bifurcated technological architecture. They are quite literally drawing a permanent line through the center of the global supply chain. And if you sit down and actually read through it's hundreds of pages of documentation that came out of that summit. But if you read it, you realize this containment strategy isn't vague at all. It is built on three very distinct, highly engineered pillars.
Yeah, it's very deliberate. Do you want to break those down for everyone?
So first, there is the absolute decoupling of AI infrastructure. Second, you have the isolation of advanced semiconductor lithography, which is, the exact mechanism that caught Martin in that clean room in Veldhoven.
Really?
And third, you have the aggressive, mandated rerouting of critical minerals supply networks.
Yeah, and if you listen to the official language they use in Washington to describe these three pillars, they constantly frame it as this coalition of capabilities.
A coalition. It sounds highly collaborative.
Right, it evokes this idea of a round table of equals, right? But structurally, when you analyze the actual binding mechanics of the agreement, it operates entirely as an asymmetric American project.
Because the United States defines the core architecture.
The U.S. dictates the rules of engagement, and they control the capital flow. The nominal allies, the other 23 nations who signed that document, are really just expected to contribute their specific capabilities.
Right, so whether that is Dutch extreme ultraviolet lithography or Japanese specialized photoresis chemicals,
right,
or German precision optical engineering.
Exactly. They are expected to just bring their assets to the table. But they are not co-authoring the rules of this new system at all. They're basically regulatory subordinates executing a blueprint drawn up entirely by someone else.
I really want to unpack exactly how Washington enforces that subordination, because it hinges on a legal mechanism that is almost breathtaking in its audacity.
Oh, you mean the FDPR? Yep.
The Foreign Direct Product Rule. We need to spend some time explaining the mechanics of this rule for you listening, because it is the actual engine driving this entire extraterritorial framework. Like, for anyone trying to understand how a single country can dictate what a Dutch company sells to a Chinese client, the FDPR is the answer.
Well, the Foreign Direct Product Rule is arguably the most expansive and aggressive piece of American export control law ever devised. Essentially, it allows Washington to assert legal jurisdiction over any product manufactured anywhere on Earth.
Just automatic.
Anywhere, provided that product contains any amount of American origin technology, software, or even, and this is the crazy part, even if it just relies on American testing equipment during its design phase.
Okay, just to put this into perspective for the listener, imagine you are a French company building a completely original piece of hardware. You source your materials from South America, you assemble it in France, you use French engineers.
Sounds very French.
But let's say 5 years ago, your design team used a piece of American simulation software just to test the thermodynamics of one tiny component. Under the FDPR, the United States government can claim that your entirely French-built machine is subject to American export controls.
Exactly, because American software and tooling are just utterly ubiquitous in the foundational, invisible layers of global tech. Almost nothing escapes this net. By weaponizing the FDPR to this degree, Washington can unilaterally dictate the commercial destinies of European industrial champions. It completely hollows out the entire concept of European strategic autonomy. I mean, you cannot logically claim to be a strategically autonomous continent if your leading technology firms, your crown jewels of innovation, can't export their physical products without explicitly asking for a license from a foreign government.
Right, it reduces sovereign nations to the status of branch offices.
Like branch offices.
But this forces a massive question, and frankly, I have to push back a bit on the fundamental premise of this 24-nation consensus. If the FDPR is this invasive, how does an alliance of sovereign nations willingly agree to a framework that so actively undermines their own sovereignty? Furthermore, there seems to be this grand illusion being sold to the public here, this idea of total autarky, where the West just builds a self-sustaining bubble.
Are the architects of Pax Silica completely ignoring the basic thermodynamic impossibility of replacing a market that consumes more than a third of the world's semiconductors? You cannot simply take a wall, drop it over a third of the global market, and expect the remaining ecosystem to function with the exact same economies of scale. It defies the basic physics of global trade.
Your pushback hits the exact structural flaw of the entire agreement. The short answer to your question is that the architects of this system are prioritizing immediate geopolitical control over long-term industrial efficiency. They're making a massive gamble.
A very expensive gamble. Yeah. The assumption that the Western Bloc can entirely replicate a highly specialized, organically developed, globally distributed supply chain without triggering catastrophic inefficiencies is just deeply flawed. High-tech manufacturing, especially in semiconductors and green energy, requires immense continuous capital expenditure, and that capital is generated by global scale.
Right, because you need the massive revenue to fund the next breakthrough.
When you artificially and abruptly sever access to the largest single consumer of those high-tech products, you don't just lose revenue, you destroy the underlying financial dynamics that fund your next generation of research and development. And to see the devastating economic consequences of this forced separation, you really only need to look at the physical and economic drain currently paralyzing the European continent as we speak.
which takes us away from the sterile clean rooms of the Netherlands and directly into the bureaucratic corridors of Germany.
Sure.
If you want to understand the macroeconomic fallout, imagine looking out the window of the Ministry of Economic Affairs in Berlin. The rain outside is gray, the exact color of industrial sludge. Yeah, and inside you have a mid-level bureaucrat, let's call her Elena, sitting at her desk, staring at a revised 5-year green transition budget. She is dragging her pen across the paper, crossing out line after line, project after project.
Because the numbers simply refuse to balance anymore, the math of the European industrial engine has literally broken.
Why is that math breaking so suddenly?
The math no longer works for Europe because the underlying variables have been artificially altered. Elena is sitting there facing the snark realization that American subsidies have fundamentally distorted the global market.
Oh, the battery manufacturers.
3 major battery manufacturers, which were originally slated to build massive facilities in Europe, have been drawn away by overwhelmingly large American financial incentives. They've completely abandoned their European expansion plans and pulled their operations entirely across the ocean to places like Ohio.
So Germany's planned gigafactories, the facilities that were supposed to power the future of the European automotive sector, they're just being left as empty, unbuilt shells.
Empty shells. And the damage compounds itself. Because of the new trade directives aimed at enforcing this tech iron curtain, Elena's department was forced to sever ties with their primary Chinese suppliers of refined lithium.
Right, they have to buy from approved sources now.
So when they went to the market to source that exact same refined lithium from the new approved American alternatives, they found the cost had literally tripled. Tripled. So she is sitting in Berlin looking at projection charts for the German domestic automotive sector that show a slow-motion structural collapse. It is the crushing weight of a systemic trap. Europe is being asked to dismantle its own industrial engine piece by piece just to prove political loyalty to an alliance that is actively cannibalizing it.
And that cannibalization isn't an accident, is it?
It is the direct intended result of a profound generational shift in U.S. industrial policy. For the last 40 years, the United States championed traditional hands-off neoliberal economics, the idea that the free market dictates where industries live and die.
Right, the invisible hand.
But recently, the U.S. has pivoted incredibly hard toward aggressive state capitalism. We see this manifested in 3 massive legislative and executive vehicles: the SHE-HPS Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA, and the recently passed One Big Beautiful Bill Act, or OBBB.
I really want to focus on the OBBBA for a moment because the mechanics of it are absolutely striking. The legislation appropriated $7.5 billion directly to the Pentagon to secure critical minerals.
Yeah, a massive amount of money.
But what is crucial for the listener to understand is that the Pentagon isn't just handing out traditional research grants anymore.
It represents a complete radical departure from past policy. The Pentagon is effectively operating like a sovereign wealth fund or a massive venture capital firm right now.
Taking direct equity positions.
They are taking direct equity positions in private companies. A prime example highlighted in the data is MP Materials. The U.S. government is injecting hundreds of millions of dollars in defense-linked equity into these firms. Yeah. But they're going even further than just providing cash. They are offering subsidized credit and organizing massive demand guarantees from major U.S. tech firms.
So they are artificially stabilizing a market that commercial lenders normally view as far too volatile to touch.
The explicit stated goal is to completely lower the downside risk for private investors and pull massive amounts of global capital forward into the American ecosystem.
This is the part that European leaders must be watching with just quiet horror. These American subsidies are not being used to create a shared, resilient Western industrial base that benefits the whole alliance. They are deeply and unapologetically protectionist.
Yeah, they're looking out for themselves.
They were designed to actively cannibalize European manufacturing competitiveness. These American financial instruments are acting like a massive gravitational vacuum, redirecting global capital, severing legacy supply chains, and pulling highly specialized engineering talent straight out of European industrial clusters and dropping them into the American Sun Belt to places like Texas, Arizona, and Ohio.
And, this vacuum effect exposes the fundamental disconnect between Washington's strategic geopolitical obsession and Europe's actual day-to-day industrial reality. Well, if you look at the U.S. national security apparatus, they're entirely, almost exclusively fixated on cutting-edge sub-2 nanometer semiconductor nodes. These are the infinitesimally small chips required for training frontier generative AI models and advanced weapons systems.
The bleeding-edge stuff.
But if you look at the European economy, it does not run on sub-2 nanometer chips. The European automotive sector, the heavy industrial sector, the automation sector, they all run on legacy nodes.
Which are chips primarily ranging from 28 nanometer to 90 nanometer architectures, because calling them legacy makes them sound obsolete, like they're useless.
Yeah, that's a terrible name for them.
Right. These are the robust, highly tested chips that control the anti-lock braking systems in your car, the industrial robotic arms in a factory, the power steering, even medical pacemakers.
Where?
And the reality that no one in Washington seems to want to acknowledge is that China efficiently manufactures and provides these highly reliable legacy nodes at a staggering global scale. By forcing Europe to suddenly cut off this specific supply chain just to align with Washington's hyper-focused AI war, you aren't hurting China's AI capabilities. You are threatening to completely paralyze Central European automotive assembly lines.
It goes even further than the assembly lines, honestly. It strikes directly at the heart of the European Green Deal.
Oh, the critical minerals again.
Yeah. The entirety of Europe's highly publicized transition to renewable energy is structurally dependent on specific critical minerals. Things like gallium, germanium, rare earths, and processed lithium. The vast, overwhelming majority of the global extraction, and more importantly, the refining capacity for these materials is located in China.
Right.
Decoupling from these specific supply chains functionally halts Europe's green energy transition in its tracks. I mean, you simply cannot build millions of electric vehicles, solar arrays, and offshore wind turbines without the underlying processed materials.
When you lay out the mechanics of this, the Pentagon equity, the draining of talent, the forced severing of legacy nodes, it feels exactly like being invited by your neighbor to build a highly secure neighborhood watch program.
Okay, I like this analogy.
You agree, you sign up, only to find out the neighborhood association is taking your membership fees and using them to quietly buy up the foundation of your own house.
Yes.
You are paying for a security framework that is structurally undermining the very home you are trying to protect.
That is exactly the dynamic at play. You are funding the architecture of your own deindustrialization. And, we don't even have to rely on analogies to prove this. We have rigorous quantitative models that map out exactly how this macroeconomic self-harm plays out in real time.
The data backs it up.
The Kiel Institute for the World Economy, working alongside the Institute for European Policymaking at Bocconi University, ran exhaustive computable general equilibrium, or CGE, trade models to simulate this exact scenario.
Let's pause and actually explain what a computable general equilibrium model is for the listener, because it's vital for understanding the fallout.
Yeah.
Imagine a massive, incredibly complex spreadsheet that mathematically links the entire world economy. If the price of steel goes up in Brazil, the model calculates exactly how that affects the cost of a toaster in France, which then affects how much the French consumer has left to spend on Italian wine. It models the ripple effects of every single trade friction.
And to ensure accuracy, they utilize the latest version of the GTP database, which is this massive, incredibly detailed data set covering 65 distinct economic sectors across 141 different countries.
So what happens when these researchers use this massive tool to simulate this specific decoupling? What happens when you artificially double the non-tariff barriers, the NTBs, between these massive economic blocks?
When you inject that level of friction into the model, the simulation breaks the macroeconomic consequences down into 4 distinct, highly predictable effects.
Okay, let's walk through.
The first is trade destruction. This is the most immediate and obvious effect. Bilateral imports between the two decoupling entities simply collapse. If the EU unilaterally imposes these barriers on China, Chinese imports into the EU are nearly eliminated, the trade is destroyed.
Right.
But the goods don't just disappear. That leads to the second effect, which is trade deflection.
Right, because if China is manufacturing a product and suddenly they are blocked from selling it in Germany, they don't just burn the inventory. They deflect those exports away from the hostile market and aggressively shift them toward third countries. They flood alternative markets with their goods, often at highly competitive prices.
Which triggers the third macroeconomic effect, import source diversion.
Import source diversion.
Yeah, so The country that originally built the wall, let's say Germany, still desperately needs those industrial inputs. Their factories haven't stopped needing components. So because they banned the most efficient supplier, they have to divert their import sourcing to other non-targeted countries.
Which means paying more.
Because they are forced to walk away from the market's most efficient provider, these new alternative sources are almost always significantly more expensive. This artificially drives up domestic production prices across the board.
So just to trace the journey of a hypothetical product here.
Yeah.
Germany blocks a Chinese braking sensor, that's trade destruction.
Yep.
China sells that sensor to Brazil, instead trade deflection.
Cool.
Germany now has to buy a braking sensor from a manufacturer in Mexico that costs twice as much import source diversion. And that brings us to the final fatal step of the model.
Trade depression. Because the overall price levels in the imposing country Germany in this scenario rise so significantly due to those more expensive inputs, their own global competitiveness drops. A German car now costs significantly more to build,
which prices them out of the global market.
This leads to an overall systemic drop in both their total exports to the global market and their ability to afford imports from the rest of the world. The entire economy depresses.
This step-by-step breakdown ties perfectly into the findings from Paul Krugman's 1980 monopolistic competition model, which the Bocconi researchers applied directly to this modern decoupling scenario.
Yeah, the Krugman model is fascinating here.
When you translate the dense mathematics of that paper into plain English, the data reveals a fascinating and frankly brutal truth about the nature of unilateral trade wars.
The Krugman model mathematically proves that in any decoupling event, the rest of the world, the countries not involved in the fight, always gains.
Because they get cheaper goods.
Right, they gain because they get better terms of trade and immediate access to all those deflected goods at lower prices. But the crucial counterintuitive finding is this. In a unilateral decoupling scenario, the perpetrator, the country initiating the block and building the wall, actually loses significantly more domestic welfare than the intended victim.
Intuitively, people assume the country being blockaded suffers the most. Why does the math dictate that the country building the wall bleeds out faster?
It comes down to market choice and scale. The initiator of the embargo is artificially limiting its own consumers' choices and deliberately forcing its own domestic industries to pay higher prices for vital inputs. They're shrinking their own economic universe.
While the victim just pivots.
Right. Meanwhile, the targeted country, the victim, maintains a much wider choice of global imports from the rest of the world and simply shifts its vast output to alternative growing markets. The victim retains access to the rest of the world's varieties and economies of scale, while the perpetrator isolates itself in a high-cost bubble.
So the data is clear on this.
The data from the Bocconi application is completely unambiguous. If the EU initiates unilateral decoupling to align with Pax Silica, overall economic welfare in the EU falls significantly, and it falls harder than it does in China.
And while Europe is wrestling with these massive, entirely self-inflicted welfare losses, we absolutely have to look at what is happening on the other side of this artificial divide. Because the narrative sold in Washington is that these embargoes will freeze Chinese innovation in place. But the source data highlights a completely different reality. China is not freezing. They are rapidly, aggressively advancing their own technological sovereignty and optimizing their ecosystem at a staggering pace.
The embargoes are acting as a forcing function. Rather than being isolated, starved of innovation, and forced to capitulate, China is adapting with extraordinary speed and intent. Let's look at the AI sector. Instead of attempting to brute force replicate the massive, closed-source, computationally heavy models favored by Western corporate monopolies models that require oceans of restricted hardware, China has pivoted its strategy to focus entirely on hyper-efficiency. They are developing and releasing lean, incredibly highly optimized open-weight models, systems like DeepSeek R1.
And by making the weights of these powerful models open and accessible globally, they are effectively democratizing AI development. They're providing foundational, highly capable reasoning tools to the rest of the developing world, completely bypassing the Western corporate stranglehold on API access. If you are a developer in Southeast Asia or Africa, you don't need to pay a massive American tech giant for access to an AI brain. You can download a hyper-efficient Chinese model and run it locally.
They are achieving absolute state-of-the-art results through pure optimization. The Chinese tech ecosystem is structurally treating algorithmic minds and top-tier data scientists as their most vital human capital. They are optimizing their computational efficiency to a level that allows them to do significantly more with significantly less hardware.
They're a completely different approach.
But they aren't just optimizing software. Strategically, China has made a decisive, massive infrastructural move that fundamentally alters the global semiconductor landscape moving forward.
You're talking about the data center mandates.
Beijing has officially mandated that all state-funded data centers must switch exclusively to domestically produced AI chips.
All of them.
All state-funded ones, yes. They are completely and systematically replacing foreign suppliers, most notably NVIDIA and AMD, in what is currently one of the most massive infrastructure build-outs in the world. China is investing hundreds of billions of dollars into their domestic AI compute capacity.
And by strictly closing these state-linked projects to foreign hardware, they're instantly creating a guaranteed, incredibly massive domestic market.
This captive demand will fund the rapid, relentless iteration and improvement of their own sovereign semiconductor industry. They're building a self-sustaining loop of capital and innovation.
So if you step back and look at this objectively, we have to pause and confront the supreme irony embedded in this data. If the macroeconomic trade models definitively prove that the country building the wall hurts its own welfare more than the target, and the target country responds to the wall by simply innovating faster, optimizing its algorithmic efficiency, and pouring hundreds of billions into building complete, unassailable technological sovereignty. What is the actual strategic utility of this technological embargo? From a purely analytical standpoint, it seems to achieve the exact opposite of its stated geopolitical goal.
From a purely economic and technological standpoint, the utility is entirely negative. It does not freeze the target in time. It accelerates their drive for absolute independence. It forces them to become self-reliant. And to see the sheer real-world friction this misguided strategy creates, you have to look at the physical arteries of global trade, the logistics networks. Let's shift our perspective away from the data centers in Beijing and look at the shipping docks of Rotterdam in the Netherlands.
Picture Javier, a senior logistics manager, standing out on the damp concrete of the massive Rotterdam docks. The sheer scale of this port is usually breathtaking. It operates with a synchronized, relentless rhythm, bringing in the world's goods to feed the European market.
It's a massive operation.
But Javier isn't watching cargo being unloaded. He is watching a massive container ship, a vessel originating from Shenzhen, slowly turning its massive hull back toward the open sea. It has been legally barred from offloading its cargo due to the newly expanded, deeply complex, dual-use technology bans originating from the Pax Silica framework.
And while he watches that physical ship turn away, representing millions in lost revenue, his tablet is buzzing incessantly with notifications from a major logistics hub in Singapore.
The data flowing into his hands is crystal clear. Global supply lines are permanently rerouting. They're actively shifting toward Asia to avoid the massive regulatory friction, the endless customs inspections, and the crippling legal liabilities of this new tech Iron Curtain. Rotterdam, a port that was historically built to be the beating heart of global flow, suddenly feels like it is sitting on the edge of a rapidly shrinking island.
Javier is standing in the cold, realizing that this massive regulatory wall isn't actually keeping China out. It is locking Europe in. It is stranding the European continent on a lonely, highly regulated pier of high principles while their actual cargo bays sit empty and the rest of the world trades without them.
This physical rerouting of the global supply chain brings us to a crucial defining concept in the economic models we discussed earlier, the fundamental difference between bystander countries and connector countries in a fractured world.
This is a huge distinction.
Connector countries, places like Vietnam or Mexico, are benefiting immensely from this geopolitical friction. Global trade is simply rerouting through them. They import the advanced components from China, they assemble them locally, and then they export the finished products to the US. They're capturing the economic windfall of trade deflection.
But Europe, despite its industrial history, is not a connector country in this new paradigm.
No, Europe is categorized firmly as a bystander country. The trade data shows that 85% of Europe's exports to both the United States and China are comprised of domestic value-added goods.
Meaning they make it themselves.
This means Europe does not benefit from the middleman game of assembling rerouted goods. When these massive trade barriers go up, Europe simply suffers the sheer, unmitigated loss of market access. They experience a severe structural deterioration in their terms of trade.
Yeah, they end up paying significantly more for their essential imports and selling significantly less of their domestic production. They catch all the friction and absolutely none of the windfall.
And what should terrify European planners is that these regulatory walls are only getting higher and more complex. It is not just about microchips anymore. Just recently, the U.S. Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, held a unanimous vote to aggressively ban all Chinese laboratories from testing and certifying consumer electronics.
The immediate logistical nightmare caused by that single regulatory vote simply cannot be overstated. If you look at the supply chain, approximately 75% of all U.S.-bound electronic devices, from smart home appliances to basic consumer tech, are currently tested, certified, and stamped in those specific Chinese labs.
Wow, 75%.
Yeah. By unilaterally banning them overnight, the FCC has introduced massive, crippling disruption into global electronic supply chains. Product launches will be delayed by months. Certification costs will skyrocket as companies scramble for limited testing capacity elsewhere, and manufacturers globally will have to physically tear down and restructure their entire compliance pipelines.
It really signals the death of the open web and the borderless global supply chain we've relied on for decades. We are watching a rapid transition from a globalized internet based on fluid collaboration to what tech analysts are now calling the splinternet, a fractured digital reality of isolated sovereign ecosystems, entirely walled off by opaque compliance rules and endlessly expanding national security mandates.
And this fragmentation isn't happening organically, It is being actively encouraged and funded by narrative wars. In the U.S., there is a heavily funded, highly coordinated campaign called Build American AI.
I've seen that.
This campaign pays influencers, leverages major media networks, and systematically attempts to frame highly efficient, open-source foreign AI development as an inherent existential national security threat.
It deliberately and cynically blurs the lines. It takes legitimate, high-level geopolitical strategy and forcefully merges it with raw, unadulterated corporate protectionism.
Yeah.
They are actively reframing the simple fact that a foreign competitor built a cheaper, more efficient AI model as a terrifying security crisis. And they are doing this simply to protect the market share and profit margins of legacy American tech giants who are falling behind in efficiency.
This relentless blending of security and protectionism creates profound, paralyzing geopolitical suspense in European capitals. European leaders are looking across the Atlantic at this aggressive, subsidized protectionism, and they are factoring in the extreme, well-documented volatility of U.S. domestic politics.
Sure.
There is a very real, deep-seated fear across the continent that the United States could abruptly, radically shift its foreign policy after a single election cycle. Europe is terrified of an America that completely pivots to isolationist transactionalism.
Exactly. Think about the risk Europe is taking. They are being asked to permanently sever their primary commercial and industrial ties with Asia to comply with this American framework.
Yeah.
If they fully comply, endure the economic depression, and then the U.S. suddenly changes course, perhaps electing an administration that completely abandons the Pax Silica framework, or decides to strike a surprise bilateral trade deal directly with Beijing, Europe will have willingly destroyed its own industrial base for absolutely nothing. They'll be left holding an empty bag.
Because of this profound existential risk, we are beginning to see the quiet emergence of strategic hedging. The middle powers within Europe, specifically nations with heavy industrial bases like France, Germany, and the Netherlands, are quietly, methodically resisting absolute compliance.
They're pushing back.
Yeah, rather than accepting the total suicidal decoupling demanded by the framework, they are attempting to construct complex avenues of de-risking. They are quietly trying to preserve vital commercial channels and protect their remaining domestic technological capabilities from being entirely subsumed and hollowed out by American legislative mandates.
It looks like the ultimate historical example of imperial overreach. The architects of this containment system seem to operate under the delusion that global supply chains' digital innovation and capital flow behave like 20th century land borders.
Right, like you can just draw a line.
They think you can just draw a thick line on a map, build a wall, and nothing crosses it. But they are completely ignoring the fundamental reality of the modern era, which is that digital networks, human capital, and global trade naturally act exactly like water. They will always effortlessly and inevitably route around artificial damage.
Absolute technology embargoes rarely achieve their objectives. They accelerate alternative solutions and workarounds. The aggressive enforcement of the Silicon Curtain will not freeze China's technological development, but will instead fracture the Western alliance. If Europe continues down this path, the Silicon Curtain will be remembered as the structural fault line that exposed the limits of American power, isolating Europe from the primary engines of 21st century global commerce.